Welcome to Access and Privacy Online, the podcast where we delve into the latest issues, challenges, and advancements in access to information and privacy rights. I'm your host, Patrick Farnsworth, and with the end of the year fast approaching, we're holding year-end review meetings with major contributors. Today, we're thrilled to have FIPA researcher Spencer Izen and Executive Director Jason Woywada joining me to talk about this year's activities. Let's dive in.
Okay, Spencer. So this has been a lot of work over the past couple of years, and I wanted to make sure that we hit the high points really quickly. And so I've got a stopwatch. We're going to be using it at various points in this interview, and I want to make sure we get 3 questions in 3 minutes here. So that is my goal. I'm going to start the stopwatch and then start with the first question.
Okay,
So what the heck did you publish this past month for FIPA?
sure. So FIPA published a preliminary report, into our multi-year research project into the Information Management Act and Freedom of Information Protection and Privacy Act. Those two laws apply to a collection of 60 public bodies. The FOIPA relates to public bodies' obligations to disclose records, and the Information Management Act, or IMA as we call it, refers to public bodies' specific obligations to control records in some way. We wanted to figure it out, what the heck, to colloquialize it, public bodies actually do towards manifesting these goals. And the way that we've decided to pursue an answer to that question is to look at the records themselves. We wanted to give public bodies essentially a chance to send us an autograph of their policies and procedures around how they disclose and manage records. That's essentially what we've been doing. We collected all of those records for over 2024. This year, we started taking a look at them finally. And this report is us just taking a look at what we found so far.
Awesome. So why is this important?
Freedom of information is consistently referred to as quasi-constitutional. The rhetoric that applicants and the general public uses to talk about this is one that really evokes democracy quite clearly. But when you look under the hood and you use freedom of information and you've experienced it yourself, there's a bit of a disjuncture between how important we all agree that freedom of information is and how the experience is. There's a significant disjuncture. So we wanted to figure out what exactly is going on to produce that disjuncture. And to that end, I think this research is important because we're getting really close to the ground of where public service and democracy meet together. That's how I would describe how important it is at a very high level.
Okay. So what's next?
We produced a list of 4 things at the end of the preliminary report that we want to look into further, largely focused around how specifically redaction takes place and how records are identified in the first place. Whenever you send a records request in to government, you've essentially given a civil servant an information retrieval task, much like you would with a search engine, where you're asking a search system to query a collection of documents and go through and give you back results. That's what you're doing doing when you interact with the Freedom of Information system too. We want to figure out what's going on over there specifically. So the next few months is going to be spent really diving deep into those very, very particular aspects of the work, retrieval and redaction, and trying to come up with an answer for how things work in BC. And at the end of the report, hopefully we can provide some suggestions on how to make it better.
Okay, that's awesome. And that's under 3 minutes. That's 2 minutes and 30 seconds. That's a wonderful little encapsulation of this project and what happened and how we got here. There's so much more to go into this. And I have to start by saying how grateful and thankful we were to work with you on this project over the last few years. How much fun it's been for me in the role of executive director working with you. I learn every time I'm working with you, every time I'm working with Jerica or Noah or Jay or Ryan or any number of the people that have come through the doors of FIPA as legal researchers, because frankly, your young neuroplasticity makes you much faster at learning things and adapting things than me, who's now getting on in age. So I really appreciate that. I very much am thankful and grateful for that opportunity. And so let's unpack some of these things now. Let's take a bit of a breath and slow down a little bit and say, okay, so let's unpack things and let's try and bring Patrick up to speed, who's sort of new looking at some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, this research is, it's understandable why it would take a while to maybe unpack a lot of this, and it's described as slow, novel research. What does that mean to describe research as slow and novel, especially regarding this report that you've put together?
I mean, I'm glad those are the terms that I'm able to say people have described to the works. That's the first thing. But I'll take the first part of it first. Slow. This has taken a while. And the time it takes is relative, of course, to the environment in which it's in. So the type of research that we're doing is inductive. So we're not starting with a hypothesis and then proving it. We're collecting data and then trying to come up with a theory of what the data says at the end of the research. You find this a lot in ethnographies, in anthropology, for example, where a researcher will spend time in a culture they're unfamiliar with. They'll become embedded in that culture, and then they'll produce what's called in the field a thick description or an account of whatever they're studying in that particular culture. So we took that idea, much like folks who were doing studies of science in the 1980s, in the 1990s, and 2000s, still today, and we kind of applied that idea to the study of freedom of information too. Now, we're not doing participant observation, so we're not going into to public bodies and watching public servants work, but we're trying to take that technique of collecting very grounded data in actual practice, actual circumstance, situated data, or aspects of that. And we're collecting it, and then we're very, very meticulously going through it and going to try and make sense of it. That's the slow part. It's slow in terms of the method itself, but also slow for a nonprofit organization that doesn't really do this. And this isn't really a type of research particularly common in civil society. A lot of research in civil society is really similar to what you might find in long form journalism, because I happen to be a journalist too in another line of work. And so the research methods that you would employ in journalism and civil society are quite similar. These are methodologies that are largely found in academic practice. And having been an undergraduate student in political science and in science and technology studies, or the program's technically information studies, this is part and parcel of what we do in school. So I brought that and I was gratefully able to bring it to FIPA, and that is largely what accounts for the slow aspect of the work. And the STS part, science and technology studies part, is I think what is meant when we talk about the work being novel as well. This isn't, again, something a lot of nonprofits engage in. It takes a lot of time on accounts of it being a slow methodology. You don't learn about an unfamiliar culture. You don't learn about unfamiliar data overnight. So what, in contrast to what other accounts of freedom of information have been, this research is not looking at things like timeliness, for example. We're thinking about timeliness still. We're thinking about timeliness not necessarily as a number, as a statistic. We're looking about the idea of timeliness as constructed in documents, for example. So a lot of the time, you'll measure and observe freedom of information as a system on a basis of how fast, on average, in an annual fiscal year, for example, did the average freedom of information request get closed? Was it 33 days? Was it 27 days, et cetera? That's one way to do this type of work. And this has been done by commissioners' offices, by other civil society groups. It's a largely well-accepted measure around the world about how to look at these systems. Our approach is different in that we're looking at now that we've figured out timeliness is a problem, freedom of information requests consistently across the country take too long. That's the zeitgeist of thought around FOI wherever you are. Mm-hmm. We know that now. But we're interested now in how do civil servants actually go about their work in an everyday setting? How are they instructed to deal with applicants? How are they instructed to look for severances? How to look for records that cause what they would call harms in technical language? That's the novel part. We're not necessarily taking a view of the system in aggregate after the fact, after all the requests have been closed, but we're trying to take a look at what happens when requests are processed, and not looking at outputs, and not necessarily looking at inputs from applicants either, but we're looking at the process itself as it unfolds and trying to generate a story of that according to the documents that we collected. I think that's at least how I can defend the description of our research as novel, in addition to the fact that it takes a long time.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's fascinating. But so Jason, this is a question for you. Being the executive director and kind of initiated this, I suppose, in a great degree. How would you describe your position in this, but also like what possessed FIPA to do this kind of research?
And I think so one, I don't think that I was solely responsible for initiating this. That's for sure. And we brought Spencer in to start doing access to information research. And this evolved from a lot of those discussions with the board amongst our broader network and the whole bit. So that's a significant dynamic. But one of the things that I did recognize coming into FIPA, I think very early on, was that the timeliness reports we're now a broken record. And that term has been used by other people in this space to describe FOI, that they were largely repeating the same issues over and over and over again in terms of timeliness being an issue, overredaction being an issue, and these are problems. But after they had been saying this for over 30 years, that narrative hadn't changed. Nothing, and so there was very much an approach from my perspective of we needed to stop the insanity and stop calling for the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And so from my perspective, it was incumbent upon me, being a new person entering that space with the abilities and opportunities that FIPA had at its disposal, to see how could we change that narrative, and what could we do that would contribute and expand our understanding in this space. And so that led to a whole rethink of what do we need to do, and how can we use FOI to explore FOI. And it was that iterative process to sort of go through initial requests, get a better understanding of the space, and then start refining what we were going to be doing in subsequent research that led us down this path towards this report and where it can go. And every interaction with broader civil society, with commissioners' offices across the country, has informed our approach to this and what we might be able to find from it. It's also been a really important factor, I think, and why working with Spencer in this and our young researchers has been so important, because it really forces you to check your confirmation bias and implicit bias at the door when you're undertaking this type of research, so that you aren't just making leaps of logic and landing on conclusions before you've got the research to back it up. So it's been really interesting to see that unfold, what we can say through the research, and I look forward to seeing more, and having Spencer unpack that for us as we move towards a final report here.
Yeah, I think also, kind of related to the novelty of this research, how big of a departure is this from in method? Like, what is so complex about this analysis, and what makes it different from how maybe other researchers have attempted to try to understand this process? I could throw that to Spencer.
I think my understanding of the complexity of the research, well, any researcher can say this too, but I certainly feel that it's evolved over time. When I started this work, I was really thinking closely about this work in relation to fields like sociology and anthropology, science and technology studies. And what kind of frankly stressed me out about the complexity of the work is I would see studies of artifacts, of material things in organizations, get reported in articles and books. And I'd read and read and read about this when I was doing the heavy aspect of my methodological reading. And there was never one source of data being looked at. There was always participant observation being used in concert with looking at material things like documents. And you could triangulate data as a part of the study. That was all those research designs involved triangulation. So I'm drawing on a field of study that works with triangulation, only one source of data. Now, granted, our study is looking at this data coming from 55 public bodies, and we have assembled 36,000 pages of data. So the sheer volume, I think, at least makes our findings a little bit more robust, if I can use that word, when we eventually present them. But what makes this work most complex for me is I was worried about how am I going to make sense of these documents without participant observation. Later, and very late, I discovered, but throughout this fall, actually, I discovered that history is a discipline itself. The historical sciences exclusively, more or less, unless you're working with oral testimony, use documents to tell stories about the past. We're working with more contemporary documents, but it had not dawned on me at the time that there was a whole field out there that did actually, as by virtue of its profession, make claims in social sciences about activity, about phenomena, exclusively using documents. This is not particularly common in sociology, anthropology, and certainly not in political science. Certainly not in political science. A lot of the research is dominated by econometric studies, using essentially the original form of data science. So what makes this research particularly complex is doing very, very context-sensitive work, which is what the promise of anthropology and ethnography is, in an environment, in a research design which is significantly less contextual than the promise of those approaches suggests. So, and the more technical things that make it complex is the sheer plurality of the data that I'm working with. It's been a really fascinating transformation from when I entered FIPA, and I had this idea. I was 18 years old, had never worked in another organization FIPA is the biggest organization I worked for at the time, and I had this idea of whenever you enter an organization, there's these really formal documents. Like I had these ideas of like the official memo, like from Yes Minister, which I discovered later in my career at FIPA, favorite show. But like all these very particular physical documents with typefaces and letterheads. And when I started to get the requests back in 2024, they were not as formal. I'll say that they were not as formal, and there is an array of formality from larger public bodies, which can have freedom of information manuals that are their own, that are produced with their own labor and have their own imprints on them, and you can see the public body's logo on there. And the smaller and smaller you get to smaller public bodies who might disclose to us screenshots of a OneNote entry, and that is their manual for freedom of information. So it's when you're looking at this data, you can't ask questions necessarily of the civil servants. Again, we have no interaction with the participants. So my challenge is to figure, okay, how do I, without the context, the very, very situated context about how this is used as a manual, I have to figure out, okay, how is this thing that says it's a manual and looks like a manual and it conforms to my prototypical conception of a manual, and then shift that to adapt to things like a OneNote entry, which are very much on the periphery of what I understand to be a manual. The only way I can even use the word manual defensively is because when we asked for a manual and wrote that, that's what we got back. So a civil servant has essentially told us through that interaction, through fulfilling our request, you asked for a manual. This is what I understand to be a manual. I've got to figure out how to describe that, and then pull out all the other content-based aspects of those documents, and figure, okay, there's some things that are expressed in bullet points. I have to figure out how to say more about a bullet point than just that. And what's the significance of rules of thumb that are expressed in there? Are there any patterns that are emerging over time? Does the typeface matter? Does the size of the document matter? Does the page count matter? Does it matter that there is a logo versus not a logo? The headings, the structure, all of these things. You've basically, it's kind of like interpreting a novel. You can do whatever you want with it. There are endless interpretive options, and it's my job to figure out and prioritize which ones are the most important, and then do that in a way that is defensible and at least true to the experience of the members or the users of those documents, who again I actually can't talk to. So I think that's how I would describe what's complex about this work. But the short way of talking about it is this is not just looking at documents. It's not just watching people. So it's very easy to mistake the social sciences, I think, as easier than natural sciences on account that the methodologies seem familiar to everyday action. It's reading, talking, writing, etc., and then recording what you see and what you observe. My caution to myself when I started this work is it can't be that simple. It can't be that simple. To the extent I'm assuming it's that simple, it's because I'm missing something. And ironically, and Jason can testify to watching me do this all the time, the more I read, the more confused and stressed I tend to get about the work. And I think we're at a point now where I'm less confused and stressed. And I have obviously some ideas about how to proceed and how to pull all the strings together about the different disciplines that I'm working with, and put them into one account. But that's the complexity behind it. It's 36,000 pages, not a lot of direction, which is the virtue of the research, and that's okay. Every ethnographer faces this. It's just managing that and prioritizing what actually needs to be described and what knowledge gaps do we need to fill.
And I think one of the things that I've really taken to heart as we've been going through this and watching Spencer go through those dynamics as he's been looking at the material and figuring out how to reach conclusions and how to make recommendations in this is the importance of having a broad network of academics and experts in the field that FIPA can draw on. Because having those individuals that Spencer can speak to, that we can speak with to understand what is taking place, so that when we can go into these presentations now amongst our broader networks and say, it's interesting because we thought we were going to get a lot of manuals back, and instead we see a lot of PowerPoints, and there's an inherent dynamic that comes in with some of those dynamics that can be problematic in some respects, not in every respect. Sometimes it's entirely appropriate, sometimes it might not be. And so what I'm looking forward to seeing in that final analysis will be some of that dynamic in terms of what are we seeing for trends. There's been this long-standing hypothesis prior to this, the implicit bias of verbal government. What does that mean? Well, are we starting to see evidence with that? when we're seeing some of these documents that are being returned? Like those are significant questions. And are we able to substantiate that? When we're not getting a manual per se anymore, or we aren't seeing policy or guidance documents. So like that's both fascinating and insightful. And we're not doing this as a gotcha research project to try and name and shame people either. This is designed to be creative, and also why that's a departure in method, because there were lots of instances in the 2 years of research that could have given rise to a headline, a quick headline, but that wouldn't have been part of the result here. And what we're trying to do, what I've been encouraged by as well in this, is the feedback we're getting from public bodies and practitioners in the field as we've done the research. Because as Schrodinger's cat reveals, right, once you begin observing, you affect the outcome. And in the process of doing this research, we know that public bodies have been changing what they're doing internally because we've asked for certain documents. And so that snapshot in time that we're creating with this also means that there's going to be changes after this. From the very act of making the request, we've impacted the organization. And that's been an important insight for me as executive director, and something that I think I'm looking forward to. And I really look forward to Spencer unpacking what's been revealed now.
Yeah, Spencer, what has been revealed from this? I mean, my take, can I just say, like, as a complete layman, isn't it weird to find that they're just like taking screenshots of things that, like, isn't it normal to think that there's formal documentation here, that there's some sort of standard, and then you realize that it's just not like that? And maybe that's revealing and it's good, but it just, to me, it makes me feel weird. So how do you, what does that reveal to you, at least as a researcher?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot recently, about the appropriateness of that. I mean, my initial reaction was, yeah, oh my God, this is super weird. This is bizarre. I know it's taken me. I mean, I've had a lot of conversations with Jason about this. We've spoken to a lot of folks in the record keeping community, largely in Vancouver Island, about record keeping in general. And I've come to a way of thinking about this as it's largely a result of being a manager of a newspaper now, and having actually engaged in the document creation that I'm studying for FIPA. And what's coming to mind is that in archivists divide record keeping based at the highest level, divide files and collections of files into operational or administrative categories. So operational categories is just respond to what the organization's mission is. Are they delivering some sort of service? All of the records related to that are operational. Administrative records are your financial HR type of records that are they're meta information. They keep the organization running, essentially. Those are administrative files. Freedom of information kind of sits in the middle of that dichotomy, of that dualism, because it's never organization's core service. We have no public body that exists to disclose records in a circular kind of loop. There's no public body that does that. And it's also it's not related to service delivery either. But it's a mandatory service that is common to every public institution. That's part of what makes administration what it is. It's common to every organization. Mm-hmm. So it sits in an uneasy area over there. And I think when we see smaller public bodies, typically, but not always, having an absence of what we might call on the outside formalized records, it suggests that there's a lack of agreement about where freedom of information falls within that dualism, and whether it's a mission-oriented or non-mission-oriented value. I cannot for the life of me remember the political scientist who first, or public administration scholar who made that distinction in relation to freedom of information many years ago. Perhaps we can put it in the show notes once they find it afterwards. But what it suggests to me, again, is that we don't have agreement about whether and how important freedom of information is, and internally, whether a public body is responsible for training someone to do freedom of information work. A policy analyst, for example, the analytical work that they undertake, I imagine, the training is either conducted on the job, but the substantive knowledge of the field is typically prerequisite. Similarly, if you're hiring a developer into a public body, you're not necessarily expecting on day one the public body is going to start teaching that person how to program. You might be teaching them some sort of logistical things or networking things about how to get onto the organization's systems, but you're not teaching them programming from the ground up. Freedom of information is a little bit different in that it's a quasi-administrative, quasi-operational service, but it's exclusive to government. There's no private organization. You can't file freedom of information requests in Canada to private organizations. And it's not in the same way that you can transfer it between government and and the private sector and accounting. Sure, there's different rules, but the objectives of the work are the same. There's no equivalent to freedom of information in the private sector this way. So what I'm most interested going into this, and I'm thinking about how the records actually instruct people to do their jobs. What scripts do they give people to respond to certain situations? If confronted with this, then what? For example, those kind of stories. What are the stories that we're prioritizing? What are the situations that we want to train people to respond to because we expect them to encounter these the most? And which situations are we leaving unaccounted for? That's what I'm kind of most interested in. But I think it's weird and it's not weird. I think it's weird when you think of it like from a perspective that's concerned with the rights associated with freedom of information. Yeah, it's a little bit odd. But if you take what I might call a more practical lens, hurts a little bit to say it, but if you think about it in cost and benefit in terms, these manuals are expensive. It takes a lot of time to write these kind of things. It takes a lot of knowledge. It takes a lot of time away from the actual delivery of services to be able to produce these things. I know that now, having to write manuals for journalism. So and having that experience was really insightful actually going into this. So I'm able to have a little bit more nuance when approaching the question of whether or not it's weird, because it depends. It depends how much time can the public body afford to send a senior FOI analyst if they're lucky enough to have a senior FOI analyst, not an FOI analyst, which is a step up from an admin assistant doing it off the side of their desk because they've got a billion other things to do. You've got a range of people who are involved in FOI work. So the OneNote screenshots, to return to that, they're likely from public bodies. I could have to go check. But my guess is they're from public bodies that don't have a full-time FOI person or FOI worker, whatever they're called. So yeah, it's strange, it's interesting, and I am looking forward to spending more time thinking about that, collapsing that dualism between administration and operational work in public bodies. I think it's a really interesting framing for FOI.
And there's so much to unpack in all of this, right? And so when we talk about what the research is revealing, like check the show notes, follow the link, read the preliminary report. There's 4 really straightforward bullet points in terms of what those preliminary findings are, as well as some next steps in terms of where that research may be going. But I think another important dynamic in all of this is, why did we include a discussion guide in this? Like what possessed us to say, okay, why should we include those questions at the end for people to sort of dissect this stuff and figure out where to move forward and how to move forward?
Yeah, I mean the number of reasons for it. One, I mean, being a young researcher, I really tried to practice a modest or a humble form of social science. Not only is that inherent to the method, but also of my positionality as someone who's very new to research, very new to work in general. When I started this, it was really important to be very, very deliberative with all the folks we spoke to, experts in the field, archivists, records managers, et cetera, about the ideas that govern their work. So I think we've had a lot of productive and very, very fruitful engagement with the archival community in British Columbia. And that's the first, I think, origin of why we included a discussion guide as a result. We learn from dialogue, so we think it would be productive if other people could learn the same method. But in that spirit, we don't have all the answers to it to solve freedom of information. Not only do have we not presented an answer yet, or some answers, because it's a preliminary report, not the final report. But when we present the final report too, necessarily, if FIPA as an organization is committed to making the FOI system better for applicants and for FOI workers and for government more generally and for citizens more generally, who don't use the freedom of information system but nonetheless benefit from it, we have a responsibility, I think, to engage everyone in that conversation. The methodology of this research is very, very specifically called actor network theory. It requires you to not make any divisions between any sort of preconceived category that you think of exists in a network, in a system. And I think that idea is very much reflected in producing a discussion guide, is that we're trying to reach all the actors in the network by giving them some suggestions about how to pursue a conversation as we continue our research. But we want to invite the wider FOI community and the public more generally into this conversation and give them some generative questions, further discussion, oriented toward the same goal of making a freedom of information system that's better, complies with the law, and ultimately lives up to the promise of freedom of information, whether you tie that promise to international law or to the passage of the law in 1993. But I think that's the spirit behind a discussion guide, is we don't have all the answers yet, and we would love it if as many people as we could help us find them.
Yeah. And I really appreciated when we received that feedback to try and make sure we included that discussion guide in there, and also the ability to recognize that we needed to check ourselves in some respects with this. And one of the two of the questions that I know that were particularly important to me were the ones that framed this as responsibility, right? And so on the applicant side, do our requests reflect our shared value of acting in good faith in a civil society? That's not a normal question that most applicants consider in making an FOI request, because they're approaching with certain perceptions of privilege or entitlement to get access to this information. And that's also meant that one of the regular calls that we get from applicants are people considering acting in a way that is counter to that may be verging on vexatious or frivolous. And so it's important to sort of recognize those dynamics and check how applicants are making some of these requests, in the same way that we recognize in ministries and public bodies that they need to consider whether they're acting in the public interest by being secretive. And so we've got a corresponding question there. Do we define our current information management as a strength or a weakness? Do we view the release of information on request as an opportunity or a threat? What would better serve the public interest? And that's a legitimate question that public bodies should technically have an answer for when they're considering the release of information, how they're managing their information, and how they view the public. So those are important considerations we wanted to front end in that discussion guide as part of this, that I'm glad we've been able to include.
Yeah, well, I think the discussion guide also kind of bridges to this final question, really, which is, where does this go from here? Obviously you're bringing in other people's insights and part of the discussion, but like, where does this research go from here, Spencer?
Yeah, we're going to focus on pretty specifically on redaction, which I talked about. And then the other half of this, which I was just thinking now, is we've talked a lot about freedom of information, but records management is also a really big part of the study. It was an accident in that regard. You sent a political scientist and you got an archivist coming out, sort of, which is me, studying the Information Management Act. The rationale behind that, I should justify a little bit, is because you cannot disclose what you cannot find. And what is really important, actually, before we answer the FOI questions that we're interested in or provide an answer to them, is to think about how records management takes place before that, in a little bit of isolation from those questions. And I think that's important because records being disclosed is their secondary use, and at least in my view. The original reason we create a record, in most cases, is not because we're trying to share it with someone else, especially not someone else who's not within the organization. That's just true of record keeping more generally. It's not always true. There's a very interesting book I was just reading about record keeping during the French Revolution, and it's called, I think, The Demon of Writing, and how records became a liability as well as a tool of political representation for the early French Republic. But the study of record keeping is really important to us, is to think about, okay, how are public servants, purely for their own administrative interests / the public interest in good administration and good governance, organizing records in the first place? If your shared drive is a mess, it's no use asking about, if your public body shared drive is a mess, it's no use asking about how they're going to disclose a record if they're never going to be able to find it. And we're really interested in those questions first. So that's the part about the Information Management Act. However, we're also interested in the work of redaction, like I talked about, and what the identity of that work is. I think that's the phrase we use in the report. And what that at least means to me is, how do we think about what the responsibilities are of the role of someone who does FOI work? And I pointed out in the report, there's not one word that we use for this collective collection of activity. There's the various titles that we found so far are FOI analysts, FOI coordinators. Sometimes document managers are responsible for it. Executive assistants, like I talked about, in smaller public organizations, it might be their executive director, a manager or director level. There's a range of roles. I think the best one is the director of marketing. The most unique assignment of freedom of information responsibilities is to a director of marketing. So you've got a range of people who are assigned responsibility for, either by virtue of it being their full-time position, or it's off the side of their desk, or it was in their job description from the start. They knew going into it, I'm doing 95% marketing and 5% FOI work. We're trying to figure out what exactly, who is involved in the work of processing freedom of information requests, and what support are they given? Where are they in the organization? How much authority do they have to sever a record and then make a recommendation to disclose it? Do they have to recommend it and then send it up to someone for sign off, or do they have the authority to do it themselves? All of these are questions of power and within organizations, among other things. And I think those are things that we really want to lock into. I don't think it's there's been a lot of attention to the role of freedom of information coordinators or workers in the literature more generally. There's a lot of work on street level bureaucracy and the various organizational roles and biographies of individuals who are doing public service, specifically in service delivery settings, where you're interacting face to face with people. There's not a lot of that work studied when you're doing a lot of correspondence-based interactions with the public, which is what we're studying right now. In fact, it's exclusively correspondence-based. You never walk into an organization and say, hello, I'd like to file a freedom of information request, and you're walking into an ICBC. That doesn't happen. That's not why you show up at those places in person.
Yeah.
And largely it was always a correspondence-based endeavor, but even then you could just drop off your application, leave. And it was mediated through text after the fact. So that's what we want to figure out. Like who is actually doing freedom of information work? What resources do they have? How many colleagues do they have? Where are they in the organization? Who's their boss? It's a really important one because 95% of the time, or not 90, maybe 85% of the time, freedom of information work is not conducted by someone who's an executive. Who do they report to? Who do they report to? The general counsel, the director of marketing. Do they report to the manager for records? Are they co-located in an organization or in a subunit of organization that does records management? These are all questions that we're interested in considering. So the next phase of this research proceeds in the new year. Once I've had a little bit of a break for the remainder of the year to consider how to approach the methods a little bit more. I've got lots of 4 books on vacation that I brought with me. It's an adventurous number that I'm not going to get through, but I'm telling myself I will. That'll help with the analysis. And then once we've settled into that in late January, we'll start proceeding with the analysis. And then we hope to have a final report produced for May 2026.
Wow.
And that's when we can start sharing our stories of how freedom of information work has been conducted so far. And then hopefully we can also produce some further questions and hold further discussions about how to improve it for the future.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm sure we're going to follow up when that does get published. I mean, I don't see why we wouldn't.
Yep. That'd be a big deal.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting deal already in the respect that, we're getting attention from this research because of what we are seeing, how thorough the research is. I'm anxious to see how we can improve the situation for records managers and the public, because that's a key dynamic here, is that we are seeing this declining trust. As a member of civil society, we want to make sure that we can try and change the arc of public trust in our public bodies and start turning that around so that the public can better trust public bodies, because they are legitimate. They have legitimate authority in civil society for a reason, and we need to work with them in order to build that, but hold them accountable appropriately. And that's what we're trying to do with this research. And so it's an interesting balancing act. We know there's lots of people that think that these resources could have gone elsewhere, and at the same time recognize that we think this is going to be an impactful study that is going to help change things for the better.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we covered pretty much everything we wanted to with you, Spencer. And I know we were taking some time out of your beautiful time off from all the work that you do. So we really thank you for spending some time with us here at the very end of 2025. We really enjoyed this discussion, and really thank you for the thoughtful responses to these questions and for the work that you've done so far. And we really look forward to catching up with you when it's finished.
Thanks for having me on.
Access and Privacy Online reviews the headlines and delivers deeper commentary on a regular basis. Be sure to subscribe to get the full episodes every week and get notifications when we release show segments and other commentary throughout the week. We look forward to hearing from you soon. Have a good one.